Welcome. My name is Dr. Amanda Weiss, a clinical psychologist with NOMV's Veterinary Mental Health Support. This is number 4 of our webinar series on mindfulness-based skills, and today's topic is understanding and managing unhelpful perfectionism with mindfulness and self-compassion. Perfectionism is broadly defined as working towards high standards and expectations, the typical overachiever or type A personality. However, perfectionism is much more nuanced than overachieving, though, and you will hear more about that momentarily. Perfectionism is commonly thought of as a personality trait, something that affects you throughout your whole life. This perspective is problematic, though, because if you see perfectionism as part of your personality, it is who you are, and that makes it difficult to change. Instead, if we can understand perfectionism as a set of behaviors that are learned and therefore something you can change, you can begin transforming your unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors into new helpful patterns that lead to more vitality and fulfillment. To be completely honest, I have been quoted thousands of times saying that perfection is unattainable and does not exist. And in the ways we have been conditioned to understand and approach perfection, it is who we are, and so everything we do must be 100% perfect. I do stand by that statement. However, perfectionistic behaviors certainly exist, and they can be either adaptive, helpful, or maladaptive, which is unhelpful. So adaptive or helpful perfectionistic behaviors support you in achieving goals, facing challenges, deepening relationships, and creating a fulfilling life. While unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors lead you to hide from the things that scare you or repeat destructive patterns that end up hurting you in the long run. Because unhelpful perfectionism is oftentimes misunderstood and it comes with hefty costs, anxiety, burnout, depression, feeling demoralized, life satisfaction, conflict, stress, and even trauma, and humans tend to try to be perfect in ways to further avoid pain and loss, this is what we're going to be focusing on today. Right? I will provide important information about the common unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors and share mindfulness-based approaches to managing these habits. Self-compassion, is also a very powerful antidote to many unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors that cause more problems and amplify our suffering. While I will only be touching upon it briefly today, I encourage you to check out the recording of last week's webinar on holding yourself kindly, which is full of information and skills to begin showing up for yourself in a kind, caring, and supportive way. So as I mentioned, not all perfectionistic behaviors are problematic. Adaptive perfectionism involves a pattern of striving for achievements that is perceived as rewarding or meaningful. It is associated with positive outcomes like self-reported feelings of happiness, life satisfaction, and conscientiousness. Those with adaptive perfectionism can function at high levels of productivity without burning themselves out. They like this type of living and it works for them. If that sounds familiar, great. If that's not how you experience your perfectionism, then welcome. Your perfectionist behaviors are like mine and so many others on this planet. And so in the service of bringing present moment awareness, so mindfulness, to patterns of our perfectionism, which is really the first step in choosing more helpful behaviors or responses, it's important to familiarize ourselves with what maladaptive or unhelpful perfectionism may look like so that you can spot it when it arrives. And so unhelpful perfectionism is characterized by rigid adherence to rules, expectations, and unrealistically high standards, and measuring self-worth in terms of ability to meet those standards. These inflexible rules are unbreakable and must be followed, and standards must be met at all costs, regardless of the circumstances and what you might be sacrificing, like sleep, improving your well-being, family time. And then any deviation from rules and expectations, immediately proves that you're incompetent, selfish, stupid, etc. And so failure is unbearable and triggers intense shame and guilt. So you end up working zealously to meet one expectation after another. It's kind of like being in a committed relationship with one's high standards. You are heavily invested in and hyper responsive to them. You experience distress when you fail to meet their demands, and you find yourself doing everything you can to placate them. This is a recipe for suffering. How one interacts with their standards really matters. On the adaptive end of perfectionism, you have a more casual relationship with your high standards. You are kind to yourself when you fall short of your ambitions. You appreciate your standards if they're adding vitality to your life, and you let them go if they're not. You don't feel obligated to do something for them either. People are more realistic about their capabilities and what is actually in their control relative to their standards, and they are more accepting of limitations, whether it be their own, the clients, the facilities. And so even if the mark is missed, one can still be satisfied with their effort and forgive themselves when they make a mistake. Hindsight can help us to move towards forgiveness rather than hindsight when you look back, when you look back with hindsight, you ask yourself what you learned from it. And then mistakes become growth opportunities instead of failures. With unhelpful perfectionism, trying to pursue inflexible rules and extremely ambitious standards, it means you'll only lose. You can never win because standards and expectations are set excessively high and the margin of error is obscenely small. So you're trapped in an unfair uphill battle and the odds stacked against you are ginormous. And there's also distress when the standards are not met. And this becomes even more complicated because standards are typically subjective, and we tend to raise these standards over time, making it tricky to determine whether you'll actually meet them. More often, with unhelpful perfectionism, you'll lose the subjectivity to you'll use the subjectivity to convince yourself that you failed. So even if you meet a predetermined standard, it does not count because blankety blank, blank, blank. Our minds feed us reasons why we accomplished a goal. It was easy to begin with. It was luck. I was overprepared, none of which really acknowledges our skills, confidence, and the other helpful roles we played in it. And so in this way, perfectionism is like an insatiable hunger that is never satisfied. Your goals and the feelings of satisfaction that come from achieving them will always be just out of your reach, and you end up feeling like you're failing even as you achieve a great deal. When your opponent is slippery definitions, perpetually changing rules, and an arbitrary benchmark that requires you to feel good about the task, your best will never be good enough, and you'll feel dissatisfaction even when standards are met. Right? There is a bright spot, though. With awareness of the rules and without your obedience to them, perfectionism loses its power. Right? Thoughts themselves hold no power. It's the obedience to the thoughts where the power lies. So choosing not to be controlled by your perfectionistic rules and standards starts with exposing the game of perfectionism says. When we name it, we can tame it. So it is important to familiarize yourself with the common sentence structure in which perfectionism thoughts are embedded. including evaluative words like should, shouldn't, have to, must, can't, and those are usually followed by the reasons the rules need to be obeyed that typically appear after the word because. So for example, I have to stay up until 3 a.m. reviewing every possible scenario because I don't want people to think I'm incompetent. Or I should be the last one to leave the clinic so I can prove myself to others. These thoughts are not facts or truths, and thoughts and feelings do not cause behaviors. We cannot stop the thoughts from showing up, dictate how long they stay, when they leave, and how loud they yell, right? Doing that would be like trying to control the weather. We ask the rain to stop, it usually doesn't listen. Right? We do get to choose what we do with these thoughts, though. The invitation is to acknowledge the thoughts without surrendering to them. Start by noticing and hearing your thoughts. Next, instead of automatically obeying what your perfectionism says, acknowledge and appreciate your thoughts as what they are. Sounds strung together into intelligible words and products of your history and current circumstances. Thoughts and rules are arbitrary. They cannot do anything to you if you don't listen to them. So pause and notice the sound of the thought and how strongly you feel it. Look past the bait and look to your goals and values. Reflect on what you want to do with your time and energy, and then redirect your attention to something more worthy or workable. Acknowledging thoughts as thoughts, in turn, allows you to watch thinking as an ongoing, primarily self-driven activity. Kind of like watching someone launch into a political rant, only you don't get caught up in buzzwords or engage with them. As loud or as upset as the person is, you can continue to watch dispassionately and even curiously, leaving the bait where it is. It can also be likened to watching a sports game in which your team, the team that you love, isn't playing. And so try watching your thoughts as a dispassionate viewer rather than a zealous fan. The invitation is to watch or observe the process of thinking, right? Speed, volume, rhythm, not the product of thinking, which is the thoughts. Another possible response is to consider what your thoughts have to say. Use them for information that illuminates who and what is most important to you and motivates values-driven behaviors. Or, tap in to your feelings and thoughts and what are they trying to communicate to you? What are they communicating to you about your feelings, your needs, your goals? Kind of much like a curious scientist rather than a critic. You're bringing curiosity to these moments. The key is to discern when to listen. Your mind is like that family member who doesn't know exactly what's going on, but tries to give you advice anyways. Sometimes it can be useful, but most of the time it's quite the opposite. And so considering your thoughts requires you to first recognize that you don't have to do what they tell you, and then assess the situation with respect to your goals and determine if the advice your thoughts are giving you will serve you in attaining these goals in a healthy, adaptive way. The function of acknowledging thoughts as thoughts, watching thinking as automatic and perpetually in motion, and considering thoughts and rules as potential sources of wisdom or rubbish is to give yourself more room to maneuver around them. Instead of defaulting to listening to and obeying your thoughts, practicing these other responses to them just gives you more options. At the core of maladaptive perfectionism is a relentless self-criticism. It is one of the most invasive and debilitating perfectionistic behaviors that leaves people feeling defeated, worthless, and useless. This type of ruthless self-criticism involves things you would never say to anyone else, or things you would never be okay with anyone else besides yourself saying to you, because these things are so mean, cruel, and hurt deeply. It's not, the constructive criticism we say to ourselves in a kind and gentle tone, which is tremendously more adaptive. These harsh narratives might criticize what you do or you as a person, or predict a bad future. Our self-critical thoughts are also paved by our deepest insecurities, but because we hear them in our own voice, we take it so seriously, like ultimate truths and facts. When we get hooked to those self-critical narratives, our minds selectively gather evidence, dismissing any contradictory claims of our adequacy, and it torments us with the reality of our defectiveness or worthlessness. Persistently berating yourself in this way will only erode your confidence over time. We can't stop these thoughts, but we can experience much less emotional distress if we unhook from them and treat them more lightly, as if a really young child or a comedian was heckling us. Or think about a cartoon, TV, or movie character that is hard to take seriously. Instead of hearing the self-critical thoughts in your own voice, try hearing them in that character's voice. Or repeatedly say the words quickly or very slow. Not good enough, 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 right? At the core, right? And yet not good enough has such a hold on us when we're hooked to it. And so you can also name the narrative in order to get some separation from it, right? So, there it is again, the I'm an imposter story. I know that one, thanks mind. Right? You can do this instead of rereading every self-critical sentence in the imposter story and then adding more chapters. Once we get some separation from these narratives, we can fly our drones up a bit higher to get, a more aerial, bigger picture perspective where we can, also see our strengths and what we did well. Through mindful awareness and self-compassion, we can also notice self-critical thoughts, put the welcome mat out and make space for the uncomfortable feelings and sensations, validate our experiences, and respond to ourselves in a kind, caring, supportive way with a warm and gentle stance, much like how we'd respond to a colleague or a dear friend in a similar situation. The mindfulness technique called RAIN can also be very helpful in not being so hard on yourself when feeling overwhelmed or triggered by your inner critic and all of the difficult feelings that follow. So RAIN is an acronym that stands for R, recognize what is going on. Recognize what is going on for you in that moment. Okay? Take a step back and observe what's showing up. Practice naming or labeling the thought or emotion. A stands for allow the experience to be there just as it is, even if it is unpleasant. Okay? Acknowledge and accept the thoughts, emotions, and sensations arriving. Letting the inner experiences you're having just be present. And as you're doing this, being gentle and understanding with yourself instead of condemning yourself. The I stands for investigate with kindness and openness. Become curious about your experience. Where do you feel the emotion in your body? What kind of thoughts are going through your mind? What was the trigger? And then lastly, the N stands for non-identification or natural awareness, which comes from not identifying with the experience. It means being a witness or observer, seeing the thought or emotion as a passing event rather than who you actually are. You can have a thought or feeling, but you are not that thought or feeling. By allowing yourself to have the experience and not be it, You can start disentangling from it, develop awareness, and return home to yourself. Uh, Another way that unhelpful perfectionism shows up is a pervasive fear of failing. That is, and this is really at the heart of unhelpful perfectionism and seems to drive most unhelpful behaviors, particularly when other people might see you fail. Fear of failure is the fear of failure is the fear that you will make a mistake or cause something to go wrong, leaving you feeling guilty, embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated, or like an imposter. Failure can be a wide range of things, such as disappointing others or hurting someone's feelings, making mistakes, receiving performance-related feedback, forgetting something, saying the wrong thing, being socially awkward or rejected by others, not being liked enough, and the list does go on. It is any outcome where you do not meet your own expectations or the perceived expectations of others. The intensity of your fear in response to failure is oftentimes grossly out of proportion to the actual size or implications of the mistake. In those moments, your drone is, on the ground and you're getting a really narrow view of the situation. So again, flying your drone up higher will get you a more accurate and fuller perspective. It's also helpful to bring awareness to and name or label your big bad, right? The deeper fear that underpins your perfectionism and that you try to avoid. And then respond to it with warm and supportive words or gestures. For the unpleasant feelings triggered by fears of failing and making mistakes, rather than hiding or running from these uncomfortable thoughts, feelings, and sensations, the invitation is to mindfully notice your discomfort and label your inner experiences, and then choose how you want to respond. This will allow you to develop flexible ways of coping with challenges and make more helpful choices. With unhelpful perfectionism, the reason behind or function of the perfectionistic behavior is a motivation to avoid or escape an undesirable consequence. It's about avoiding failure, right? Versus in adaptive perfectionism, the motivation is to approach a desired consequence. It's about seeking achievement that is experienced as fulfilling. The distinction is whether you act to obtain a reward or to avoid an aversive consequence like failure, making a mistake, or disappointing someone. As humans, we're programmed to avoid things that make us feel uncomfortable. So naturally, we would prefer to avoid failing, especially if we know we will severely criticize ourselves if we do. Some people avoid failure by working harder, right? Repeatedly checking their work, working too much, seeking reassurance, which is a recipe for burnout, exhaustion, and feeling demoralized. While others avoid the potential for failure by procrastinating, taking a safer option, or avoiding the task or procedure altogether, which then can drastically narrow one's options, including learning and growing, and then it makes life less fulfilling in the long term. The reality is that both avoidant habits and self-criticism can ultimately cause you much bigger problems in your life. Fear of failure has its best friend avoidance on speed dial because it is uncomfortable. And while the avoidance may feel helpful in the short term, again, it causes much bigger problems in the long term. So rather than getting entangled with thoughts and letting the urges put the leash on you and pulling you in unhelpful directions, try to mindfully notice and name the fears and urges to avoid as they arise, doing this with curiosity and non-judgment, Taking slow, deep breaths. Offer yourself a soothing or comforting gesture and reflect on how the person you want to be in this situation would show up. What values do you want to dish out at that moment? And then put the leashes on your fear and discomfort and bring them along with you as you take steps and actions towards what matters most. With unhelpful perfectionism, there's also a focus on the outcome, only caring about the results, and any imperfect results negates all effort. Rather than savoring the process of tasks or procedures and finding meaning in doing them regardless of the outcome. As humans and vet med professionals, I am gently assuming that you love or, really appreciate control. And by being more outcome oriented, you're actually giving away control because you have more control over your actions and how you do them, the process, than the results of your actions, right? The outcome, what you get from your actions. So rather than pouring your time and energy into outcomes that may be out of your control, you can redirect your arrow toward tangible things that are in your control and that you can take action take action on in that moment. This is very relevant in your industry where you competently did everything you could with the research, training, and knowledge you had, yet factors out of your control were at play and an animal still died or the presenting issue persisted despite your best efforts. Your mind is naturally going to remind you of everything that went wrong. No need to listen to that lecture on repeat. Right? Try thanking your mind for trying to protect you by replaying the circumstances so this won't happen again. Right? But spoiler alert, we will never be able to control what is out of our control, no matter how many times we analyze it. Right? And so instead, remind your mind of everything you did do, everything that was out of your control and what you learned from it. Regardless of the results, if you define your success based on process or how you approach tasks, then you can control how successful you are. In the case of maladaptive perfectionism, success falls outside of your control because outcome is made to be the measure of success. When you're focusing on outcome, you'll feel like you're continuously grasping for something that's just outside of your reach, living in a limbo of almost that quickly translates into not good enough narratives and feeling like an imposter. The invitation is to focus on the process, where you gently loosen the grip and let go of expectations that you should or have to be better. Okay? Be aware of your mind's self-limiting evaluations and try using the skill of describing in a neutral, fact-based way instead of using evaluations or opinions that are loaded with judgment and emotion. The distinction between process versus outcome is where you direct your attention. Obsessing over outcomes at the expense of process means you're letting the present moment where you can take action slip through your fingers and you're missing out. Managing your attention is about intentionally choosing what to focus on, practicing the skill of attending. That will help to increase the control you have over the target of your attention, and using the skill of redirecting your attention when your mind inevitably goes astray, because that's what our minds do. You might even be pleasantly surprised when you find more pleasure in simply doing the things when you focus on the process instead of the outcome. So the things themselves are more pleasurable regardless of the outcome. So those with unhelpful perfectionism enjoy what they do much less, and it ultimately undermines precisely what it is intended to achieve, be it success, productivity, or happiness. The doing is stressful because they berate themselves the whole time. No outcome is ever good enough. So even being done with a task comes with disappointment. They may be so overwhelmed and become paralyzed because their unrealistically high standards make taking any steps forward seem daunting. And they don't want to fail by making the wrong move. So instead, they desperately spin their wheels with little to nothing to show for it, right? Again, recipes for suffering. And so while some or all of these unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors may sound familiar or even intimately familiar, I do want to emphasize that there is no typical perfectionist. It can look different from one person to the next. The invitation is to get to know your unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors because, again, when you name it, you can tame it. It's not surprising that unhelpful perfectionism is linked with a variety of mental health disorders like depression and anxiety, OCD, substance abuse, as well as more daily stress and negative mood states. And this appears to be consistent across cultures. So it is vital for our well-being, and you deserve to have and utilize strategies to manage unhelpful perfectionism because it's not effective and typically ends up hurting us more. There are no quick fixes when working towards not being perfectionistic without trying to do this perfectly. And not every aspect of your perfectionism needs to change. Only the behaviors that are not workable and tend to cause more challenges or suffering. Hopefully, the information and mindfulness skills shared today will help you notice your unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors and give you options to respond and show up for them in a more adaptive way. As I mentioned earlier, self-compassion is a powerful antidote to unhelpful perfectionism. So be sure to check out the recording of last week's webinar on holding yourself kindly. You can also learn about more about mindfulness-based skills from the recording of my presentation on Mindfulness 101. Like learning any new skills or trying something different, it will take time and likely feel quite uncomfortable. And it's going to come with its own unpleasant inner experiences. So please be patient with yourself, yet persistent in your efforts. Practice holding yourself kindly and gently and repeatedly return to what matters. Return your attention when unhelpful gently and repeatedly return to what matters when your unhelpful perfectionism tries to move you away. In the deeply wise words of Brené Brown, perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from taking flight. Thank you for being here today or for taking time to watch the video. I hope you can join us in 2 weeks for the holiday edition of Mindfulness-Based Skills. And I want to end by saying the unhelpful perfectionist in me sees and honors the unhelpful perfectionist in you. And so I wish you many mindful and gentle moments today and every day. Thank you and take care.